Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to do a live stream here today. Actually, this is a series that Tiffany from Makeup and Monarchies and I cooked up. And she's away today. She's got some personal things she needs to attend to. So we'll be on later in the week, probably Friday afternoon, early evening. We'll put out notices about that. But this is a series exploring medieval power structures, and we're comparing the actual historical Wars of the Roses with Game of Thrones, the movie. So part one, we talked about, the key figures, the monarchs, the broad historical brushes that actually occurred during that period in England, the 15th century. And so today, and we'll revisit this again later in the week on Friday when we go live again. But today, I thought I'd go ahead and do a little bit of discussion here. Go on to part two, where we're actually going to dig in and see if we can come up with some apt comparisons between the people, the actual historical figures involved in the Wars of the Roses with the fictional characters in the Game of Thrones. So I thought we'd start off here. Let's discuss the fellow who wrote the Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. Of course, everybody should be familiar with him. He borrowed heavily on this period in English history, Wars of the Roses, but was clever enough, creative enough, and talented enough to switch things up and change things around. So it's not a one-on-one comparison. So that's something he's very talented man, and I've watched the series. It's been a few years, but very good stuff. So let's start out here with talking about what the Wars of the Roses were, and I think that'll be a good starting off place. So let's take a look here. So the Wars of the Roses occurred, of course, in England from around 1455 to 1487. Some people may have differing dates, but that's a generally accepted time period. What were the Wars of the Roses? Well, they were a series of brutal civil wars fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And we went into the genealogical tables and familial relations and that type of thing last time, but we'll go through it again on Friday. But basically, you have King Edward III had, I believe, 5 sons, princes, and 2 of those sons had lineage down through the Wars of the Roses, and they're called cadet branches, meaning that the monarchs who took the throne after Edward III, with the exception of Richard II, were not in a direct line from Edward III himself, meaning son, grandson, great-grandson, etc. They were from other princes, other brothers who were junior. And the House of Lancaster is descended from John of Gaunt, one of the sons of Edward III, and I believe the York cadet branch was, I believe, is it Lionel or Clarence? I need to check that, but we'll get that nailed down next time. So one thing that became to symbolize this period and why it was called the Wars of the Roses, actually in the Victorian era, historians and literary figures sort of coined that phrase. Before that, it was called the Cousins' War, because it was a cousins' war for the throne. But as you can see here on the screen, there's the emblems of the 2 houses. Okay. On your left, you would have the red rose, the House of Lancaster, and the white rose, the symbol of the House of York. So that was something that was invented, I believe, by Victorian historians and writers. So I thought that it would be interesting and a good starting place to go ahead and compare some of the historical figures from the Wars of the Roses with the characters in the Game of Thrones. Again, Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, who wrote I believe, a book, and it got turned into a screenplay and movie. Some of the major themes throughout both really are succession to the throne, familial betrayal, ruthless pursuit of power, and hopefully we can show how history and fiction reflect dangers of unbridled ambition and political instability. And I tend to believe that anybody studying this period who's a student, or particularly if you're from Britain or the UK, I would think that the reason why there's so much popular interest and passion in this period is because it is a reminder of how to avoid dangers of unbridled ambition and political instability. So let's have some fun here. Let's talk about Robb Stark, okay? And whether or not it's an apt comparison to compare him to Edward IV, right? So Edward IV was from the Yorkist house, right? And to recap, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, was a noble and from the cadet house of the Lancasters when Richard II was king. Bolingbroke was his first cousin. Richard II was a cruel ruler, ineffectual, disliked by nearly everybody, played favorites, heavily taxed, didn't have any significant military achievements, and was basically a very bad monarch. So Bolingbroke was exiled for 10 years by Richard II, and then he was stripped of his inheritance and his lands. So in 1399, Bolingbroke comes back from exile from France to England, deposes Richard II, is made king, and the House of Lancaster starts as that cadet branch of the House of Lancaster starts a series of monarchs. Henry IV's son, Henry V, becomes king when his father dies, the hero of Agincourt. He dies and he leaves his son, an infant, Henry VI. And there was a regency governing council until he became of age. Henry VI, okay, had a severe mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia. And in the end, we'll get into this later on Friday in more detail, but in the end, Edward IV, whose father was the Duke of York, Richard, Duke of York, ends up deposing Henry VI, imprisoning him, and becomes King Edward IV. And so the first comparison that I thought we would have fun with is whether or not Robb Stark's character in Game of Thrones is inspired by Edward IV. So Edward IV, like Robb Stark, was a young and charismatic leader who rose to power quickly through battleful successes. Both figures won early victories but were ultimately undone by internal divisions and betrayal from within their own ranks. So, we shall see, but we have Edward IV, perhaps Robb Stark's character being inspired by him. One of the other themes that's prominent here is you get two houses in the Game of Thrones that mirror the Lancaster and York houses in the Wars of the Roses. That's Baratheon and the Lannister. Targaryen also vied for the Iron Throne, okay? And just like in the Wars of the Roses, where the houses of Lancaster and York fought bitterly over the competing claims, thus, same thing here in the Game of Thrones with Baratheon and Lannister. So one of the major themes throughout the actual history of this period and in the play and movie is the concept of a rightful ruler, his legitimacy being questioned and manipulated in both real and fictional narratives. For example, Richard III's claim as protector of the realm echoes the way various Game of Thrones characters attempt to justify their bids for power, such as Stannis' claim based on being the true heir to his brother. All right. And of course, there's Cersei Lannister. And we'll get into that later on Friday. But very interesting stuff here. Let's see what we've got. Another parallel here is I feel that in the Game of Thrones, Robb Stark's marriage to Talisa could have been inspired by Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville being of the minor gentry, not a high noble woman, very unpopular with his noblemen and families when he married her. She had been previously married, her husband passed away, and she had children from the previous marriage. And Edward IV's right-hand man, the Earl of Warwick, right, was not happy about that and eventually tried to depose him over that. So again, you've got these themes here, these marriage themes. Edward IV versus, or it's actually maybe superimposed on, or actually the other way around, Robb Stark being superimposed on Edward IV. Okay. Also, other themes that we have here is some of the kings, well, many of the kings of Game of Thrones being deposed, Baratheon and his son Joffrey, just like Henry VI in England. So we do have an awful lot of parallels. For example, here's an image of the House of Lancaster inspiring the Starks and or the Lannisters. Okay. And again, Friday, when Tiffany's here, we'll go through quite a few more. And there's a picture of George R.R. Martin. All right. Good stuff. Very talented man. Here is an image of King Henry VI, who had the mental illness, who actually became king when he was an infant. His father, Henry V, died campaigning in France. And we'll talk about him going forward much more. Henry VI was deposed by, Edward IV. Richard III, the baddie, right, according to Shakespeare. There's an awful lot to talk about Richard III. Not only the historical narrative, but Richard III, the play by Shakespeare, but also the discovery of his remains in 2012 and the reinterment of them in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, and how historians may be shifting some of their opinions of him because the discovery of his remains sparked new historical debate on that, which has always been around, but not as prominent. Princes in the Tower, of course, these would be Edward IV's sons. Edward V, who became king briefly, and then Richard of Shrewsbury, also the Duke of York, who disappeared under Richard III's reign, and they were never seen again. We'll talk about this in the future. Here's a picture of Edward IV, king, House of York, and then there you are. So I just wanted to do a little bit of an overview today. We're going to delve much more deeply into this stuff on Friday, and we'll catch you then. I just wanted to do a little bit of an introduction, some themes, some ideas, some broad brushes as far as the comparisons and some of the historical and fictional characters, historical figures and fictional characters. We will catch you Friday afternoon, early evening. We'll put out notices on our channel, Tiffany Makeup and Monarchies, and of course, here on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll catch you on the upside. See you later.